I'm diving deep into one of the biggest policy shifts in WA housing we've seen in recent years. It's the state government's brand new build-to-rent incentives announced over the last week of October. This initiative is being called a potential game changer for Perth's rental market. Why the government doing this? You might ask. Why push build-to-rent at all, and why not just build more traditional housing? One of the build-to-rent directors described it as making the renter the customer and flipping the traditional dynamic on its head. You'd have to think that's going to attract developers. And when you consider our rental yields here, relatively high, especially at this point still compared to the other states, I think it's going to really attract the same kind of momentum we've seen in Melbourne or Brisbane, and it could transform how rental housing is delivered here.
Welcome to Perth Property Insider, where you will learn how to grow your wealth and improve your life using Perth property. Our show is brought to you by Investors Edge Real Estate, the highly rated and award-winning property management, sales and buyers agency servicing the whole of Perth. Now, here's your host, Jared Mann.
Welcome back to Perth Property Insider. I'm your host, Jared Mann from Investors Edge Real Estate, and today I'm diving deep into one of the biggest policy shifts in WA housing we've seen in recent years. It's the state government's brand new build-to-rent incentives announced over the last week of October. This initiative is being called a potential game changer for Perth's rental market. But what exactly does it mean for investors, developers, and renters? I'm going to break it all down. What the new policies include, how could it affect Perth's rental market, whether developers will actually take it up, how financing and tax changes make it more viable, what's happened in other states with build-to-rent, and the types of tenants and communities this model really suits. So let's get into it, shall we? So in late October of 2025, where we were at the time of recording, the WA government has officially launched its $75 million build-to-rent Kickstart Fund, administered by Keystart. The goal is to get large-scale rental apartment projects moving, the kind that can add hundreds of new rentals to the market at once. So here's what's included. There's no interest loans covering up to 30% of construction costs for 3 years. So that can really help get all of that deposit amount into a project and really enable the developer just to bring in funding for that remaining 70%. And then they're offering low interest loans on that 30% beyond the construction period for another 7 years after completion. So can really span out the time for that project to increase in value and enable a developer to refinance Keystart out. And 7 years is a pretty decent time frame for them to be in a position to, refinance out that financing once the project's increased in value. So projects must have at least 40 new dwellings, which is a pretty significant size of project, and stay in the rental pool for a minimum of 10 years. So really looking at providing a long-term rental. And at least 30% of the units must be affordable, capped at 25% of a tenant's income. I really like that last point because we need to cater and still provide affordable housing. And if the government's providing all these incentives and enabling the financing, then it's good that it's still going to be accessible and not just be a premium rental option that doesn't enable the lower end tenants that can't afford as much to still get access. So on top of all of that, they've increased the land tax concession to 75% for 20 years, which is one of the most generous incentives offered in Australia. So Premier Roger Cook and Treasurer Rita Safiotti have said this is about making the numbers stack up for developers, because up until now, build to rent just hasn't really taken off in WA at all. So let's take a look at why it matters for Perth's rental market. The rental market here, no surprises, is now under real pressure. Vacancy rates are still sitting near record lows, hovering around the 0.5% in some areas. We've got huge demand chasing too few homes, and they're just not building enough still. So build to rent is being positioned as a way to increase rental supply at scale. Now, let's be clear, this isn't an overnight fix, because These big apartment developments typically take 2 to 4 years to deliver. So even if industry gets going, it could take even longer than 4 years by the time that they get everything approved, they get the builder lined up, they get all their financing together, they get to site, they construct, they finish, and then they rent them all out. So even, I guess, if a handful of new projects get off the ground each year, that adds hundreds of dwellings to the rental pool and can help over time. So housing expert like Professor Hal Pawson from UNSW have said that while the impact won't be instant, it's an important medium to long-term strategy for balancing supply and demand. And for tenants, it brings something new, security of having a much longer term rental and stability of that. So WA's model also mandates, interestingly, that 3-year lease options are available. So renters can actually plan ahead and have a longer term rental being offered, which is a big shift from the typical 12-month leases that we see now. And it's about, I guess, creating a new type of rental experience, professionally managed, well-maintained buildings with long-term tenure. So, do you think developers are actually going to take this up? That's the million-dollar question. Will they go for it? So far, early industry feedback has been positive, with the Urban Development Institute of Australia, WA, calling the fund a game changer. That makes apartments financially viable again, they've said. So up until now, Perth's build-to-rent pipeline has been absolutely tiny, just over 1,500 apartments total in various stages. And we compare that to Victoria's 25 plus thousand and New South Wales 15,000. So you can see there's a big gap between Perth, WA, and the other states, and how we've been embracing it with haven't been embracing it with so little in the pipeline. So the main barriers so far have been the high construction costs, the tight project financing, and the uncompetitive tax settings. So the new fund and the 75% land tax discount directly tackles those pain points, and developers can borrow cheaper, hold for the long term, and actually make a margin. And that's why industry groups expect we'll see multiple proposals lodged before the end of 2025. If it works, we could see institutional investors like super funds and insurance companies start looking at Perth the way they already are in Sydney and Melbourne. So what's happened in the other states? To understand where this could go, it's worth looking at how build-to-rent has played out elsewhere. In Victoria, they've led the charge with about 25,500 build-to-rent apartments either built, under construction, or in planning. And the state offered a 50% land tax discount and streamlined approvals for higher density rental projects. Developers like Mirvac and Greystar have been quick to move, building renter communities. So they've been doing that in places like Docklands and Brunswick over there. And occupancy rates are typically above 90% and tenants are staying longer than average. So some success there. In New South Wales, they've followed a similar path with 15,000 build-to-rent units in the pipeline, mostly in areas like Parramatta, Sydney Olympic Park and the inner city. And they've made build-to-rent part of their housing strategy to deliver more apartments near jobs and transport. When we look to Queensland, they took a more direct route, co-developing projects through a pilot program. One standout was Mirvac's Live Anura in Newstead, Brisbane, 2 towers of 396 apartments with about 25% set aside for affordable rentals. It filled quickly, showing renters love the product when it's done well. And interestingly, WA actually has one of Australia's first build-to-rent projects, which was Sentinel Real Estate's Element 27 in Subiaco. It leased out almost all its apartments within 9 months of opening, still quite a while, proving that Perth renters will embrace the model when it's available. So the blueprint exists. WA just needs the scale and the incentives to catch up, and now it seems to finally have both of these.
Just real quick before we continue on with the episode, are you getting my email updates yet? If you're not, you're missing out on our suburb intelligence reports, which we tailor and prepare for your individual suburbs of interest, showing advanced stats and insights. Must get onto those. And I also send out exclusive invitations to our events including webinars, sundowners, and workshops. So if you're not getting those, head on over to investorsedge.com.au/join and make sure you're receiving my email updates.
So why the government doing this? You might ask. Why push build to rent at all, and why not just build more traditional housing? The answer is density and scale. So Perth's housing stock is still dominated by detached homes, and we're running out of land close to the city. Build to rent allows the government to drive infill development, getting hundreds of homes onto well-located urban sites close to jobs and transport. It's a way to leverage private capital for public good, and the state can't fund all the housing that we need. But by partnering with developers and offering low-cost finance, they can share the risk and accelerate delivery. It's a clever way to fill the gap between private development and public housing, creating high-quality, long-term rental options that sit in the middle for people. So who does build to rent really suit? Let's talk about the people side. Who are these developments for? So there are a few key renter profiles that build to rent really serve. So we've got the long-term renters. There's families, older tenants, or anyone who wants lease security and consistent quality. We've got the professionals and renters by choice who could buy but prefer that flexibility and an inner city convenience to things. And then we've got the key workers like nurses, teachers, police who qualify for the affordable portion of the units, often paying 20 to 25% below market rent. So these buildings aren't just functional, they're designed as communities. There's a lot more thought put into them. You'll see gyms, rooftop gardens, co-working spaces, cafes, even dog parks. Operators host resident events and maintain the building professionally, a bit like a hotel, but you actually live there long term. One of the build to rent directors described it as making the renter the customer and flipping the traditional dynamic on its head. So for tenants, it means no more worrying about a landlord selling the property from under you. And for investors, it means a more stable institutional grade rental market taking shape in Perth. So what it all means for WA's future? Well, looking ahead, these changes could reshape Perth's rental landscape over the next decade. WA's package, the Kickstart Fund, with concessional loans and that 75% land tax discount, are the most generous in Australia now. So you'd have to think that's going to attract developers. And when you consider our rental yields here are relatively high, especially at this point still compared to the other states, I think it's going to really attract the same kind of momentum we've seen in Melbourne or Brisbane, and it could transform how rental housing is delivered here. So we'll likely see a shift towards that high quality, high density living with more long-term renters, more professional management, and more choice in the market. Will tenants be embracing of that higher density? Well, we kind of need them to. And I think the motivation's definitely there with affordability driving things more in Perth now, with prices having gone up so much. People have to look towards that higher density to afford to live in popular areas that still have all the amenities. And I think that's still bigger picture going to be a very good thing for all of us taxpayers, not to have to keep paying for infrastructure and expansion further and further out on the city fringe, leading to more and more sprawl. Why not make the most of infilling in the areas that already have the amenities and the infrastructure? And I also like to think that for all of us property investors that prefer to invest in houses and have that land component, we're still talking about very different types of renters that are going to, and high density apartments only going to suit those certain types. So I don't think it's really going to take demand away from the typical type of house. I think it's just going to provide a gap of something that's needed, a more affordable option for people, and it'll increase the attractiveness of moving to Perth because we've got ever-increasing population, people wanting to get into the state. If they don't have a housing option, then how can they come here? How can we, I guess, keep increasing our workforce to be able to provide the critical jobs and things that we need if we can't actually house people? So while build to rent isn't a silver bullet for affordability, it's a strong step, I think, towards that more sustainable, balanced rental ecosystem. So if you're an investor that has deep pockets, you certainly need them for doing a 40-unit apartment project. But it's worth watching how this plays out. And it's certainly a space that throwing around and thinking of whether or not it has a place in my portfolio. So if it takes off, it could influence the value of surrounding properties, shift the rental competition a bit, especially if you've got apartments in certain areas and then you get an increasing supply of the build to rent coming in. It could shift up and increase that supply, maybe reduce the pressure and demand on that type of dwelling. So just be careful of that if you're a unit or apartment holder. Again, we're talking about small drops in the ocean at the moment. It's going to take a long time for these projects to come to fruition, 3 to 4 years probably in most cases. So it's not going to be a massive impact, I don't think, for the foreseeable future, but let's keep an eye on it. And I think it's an interesting way for how government can further stimulate and incentivize private industry. So if it goes well, you never know. Like, why wouldn't the government look at doing similar incentives with houses? Now, that would be something I'd get excited about and get behind. Individual incentives for individuals to construct houses along these same lines. Imagine how crazy that would go off, and how much extra rental supply we'd have getting created then if they made it only for new construction, if they funded 30% of the deposit needed and carried a loan back for 7 years on that 30% at low interest, and they gave you a 75% land tax concession. Jesus, I'd be lining up for that. So maybe the incentives won't be as great if they ever move to do that, but I think it's an interesting model that could be rolled out for houses and for individual property investors if the government was actually open-minded enough to do that. So there you have it, Western Australia's big build-to-rent push. It's about more than just new apartments. It's about reshaping our rental market for the long term. And if you found this episode useful, please subscribe, share it with a fellow investor, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps more Perth investors find the show. And if you do want some help with growing your portfolio or improving your returns from your rental, head over to investorsedge.com.au. That's where you'll find all the info on our services and can get our help. So thanks for tuning in. I'm Jared Mann, and I'll catch you next time on Perth Property Insider.
Just a reminder, the information discussed in this podcast is general in nature. As we don't know your specific situation, you should always seek professional advice before taking any action. For free market reports on your suburbs of interest and other helpful resources to grow your wealth, make sure you join my property investor update at investorsedge.com.au/join. And finally, make sure you're a member of our Perth Property Investment Facebook group to be part of the conversation with other like-minded investors, get help to your questions, and get a feel for what's going on out there in the market. I'll see you in the group.